So as Haley was saying, I'm with CC Ulster. So I'm based in the Ulster County office out of Kingston. And I'm not actually going to go through all the slides I have today because Haley will send them out afterwards. I'm just going to give a really brief overview and speak more to the flooding and storm risks that we're seeing and some of the resources around that before Anna talks more to water management and all the great things that she's up to on her farm. Sorry, I'm just gonna, I need to switch on presenter view real fast. So this is part of a series, so the recordings will go up on the YouTube. But just quick plug for the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment. This was released early last year, and this is what kind of inspired us to talk about some of the major impacts they identified in that study, which had about 250 researchers and folks from NYSERDA on board. So one of the big things was a change in the amount and duration of precipitation, which includes heavy rainfall as well as drought risk. So what we're seeing is a lot more years in the past couple of decades where we're getting, up to 60 inches or more of rain compared to the past, century, basically. So we had over 60 inches in 2023, which was one of the top 10 years on record. And a lot of those years where we're getting over 60 inches, it's because we're seeing these intense rain events that causes flooding, like, of course, Irene, everyone's familiar with, but just more events where we're getting, 10 inches per rain event, in a very short amount of time. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today and how you can evaluate your risk. So again, these slides will come out where you can look at some of the data on that. But if you're worried about flooding on your farm or you want to evaluate your risk, the first place you're going to want to go is to the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. So the main place you can find those is the FEMA Map Service Center, or if you're in Ulster County, you can look at the map layer on the Ulster County Parcel Viewer. I'm not sure if that's available in other counties. It's going to look something like what you see here with the different flood zones. And the big takeaway I want to mention as far as the different flood zones go is that when you're talking about a 100-year flood zone, it's not that those floods can only happen once in 100 years. It's that you have a 1% annual chance of flooding in that area. And you can look at the base flood elevation, which is the black wavy lines here, will give you an idea of what that 100-year flood would look like for that zone. So the different shading tells you different things. And if you need help interpreting that, you can always reach out to me or your county floodplain manager. But also some resources here for, what happens if your fields do flood, especially if you're in the vegetable world. There's some special considerations for that. And, of course, what you want to do to document your losses if you have crop insurance, or you can go to FSA and fill out a crop loss report. We've also got some resources here for planning for resilience. So things like improving your soil health can help with both, flooding, those intense rainstorms to prevent erosion, as well as maintaining that water in the soil during droughts. So we'll talk more about things like drainage and swales today, but there's also things like riparian buffers if you have a waterway that goes through your farm. And then, of course, on the flip side, considering irrigation and other methods of water storage. There's some specific considerations for livestock here, including emergency action plans. So that's something folks out west have had for a long time because of wildfires, but a lot of farms here have not developed yet. So there's some really good resources here for developing that, and we hope to do more on that in the future. And then I've also got information on risk management and recovery funds from folks like the USDA. And funds for implementing some of these resiliency strategies from your local soil and water and other sources, as well as more educational resources on these websites. So that's my 2-minute spiel. And then with that, I'm going to pass over to Anna. And we'll leave some time for questions at the end. But again, everyone will get the slides with the links.
Thanks, Catherine, for sharing that info. All right, so here I go. I'm gonna share my screen too. Just give me a sec. I'm going to share this, get into slideshow mode. Alrighty, so hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for strategies for climate resilient farming. If you hear rustling in the background, that's just my dogs going stir crazy. Don't mind them. Hi, so I'm Anna Zabirova. I'm a farmer here at Unbroken Acres, which I started back in 2020. This will be my 15th overall season farming, mostly in veg, mixed fruit, have worked with livestock. I'm also currently the technical assistance provider for the Climate Smart Hudson Valley region, which I can discuss further at the end of the presentation as a good option for finding funding for some of these practices that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start off with a brief overview of the hydrologic cycle because it is important, right? We can't excuse ourselves from the global system, and we have to understand the impacts to what's happening to our global system to inform our decisions that we make in terms of land management, right? So the whole reasoning here to share this slide is that, right, evapotranspiration goes into the atmosphere, right, condenses and cools, forms into clouds, eventually makes its way to precipitate somewhere, somehow. Snow, rain, doesn't quite matter. But the overview here and the takeaway is that it is a cycle, right? And groundwater infiltration is a big storage sink, but ultimately it does all return to the ocean. So just to keep that in mind, right, as to the impacts of why we will be dealing and how we will be dealing with more water in the atmosphere because of climate change. So Catherine had started to touch on this a bit, but in essence, higher rates of evaporation are due to an increase in average temperatures, right? That's just the fact of climate change and the nature of what's happening to our climate currently. So higher rates of evaporation lead to higher rates of precipitation, not necessarily in one location, not necessarily, over land or the ocean. They're sort of modeling both either which way. It's hard to tell. It's a global system that we're impacting greatly, so we're not quite sure where we're going quite yet. So also the thermal expansion of sea ice and the melting of sea ice will be contributing to larger evapotranspiration rates as well. So this is just from the IPCC report back in 2007 for a projection toward the end of the 21st century in a change of precipitation intensity and standard deviation. So as we can see, our region here in the Northeast, we're going to get a whole lot more precip, right? Here's a map from the National Climate Assessment showing an annual percentage change from the difference from 1958 to 2012. And as we can see in our Northeast region here, 71% increase in total precipitation. That's quite a lot to deal with. So today's talk is really going to be focusing on how to mitigate water. I will be discussing the opposite side of drought, but just for our region and our sake, this is another graphic showing from the Wall Street Journal in combination with NOAA in changes in precipitation over the last 30 years. So we could see the stark difference, in the entire US. Here is an interesting graphic that I thought worthwhile including as we're going through our introduction. This is a change in runoff percentage with impacts relating to climate change, right? So we can see that in the central US and down all the way into South America here, into the Panama and such, in Mexico, it's going to be a lesser water flow. And up north, since we're having a lot of melting of ice, glaciers, and otherwise, those runoff percentages will increase for a time. And so those impacts, they're varying in different parts of the globe. That's just simply what I'm trying to highlight here. So this is the change in Palmer Drought Severity Index. We can see some really crazy trends here for Canada, definitely Africa as a continent as a whole, the Middle East, parts of South America. So it's a global system, nobody's exempt from it, and changes are happening, are the main takeaways. Paired with that, right, more water, this is the forecast for 90-degree days, greater than, right? So this is a model predicting out to 2070 with significantly lower emissions, which we can only hope that that's the case. But just to keep things sort of in an overall pictured view, because I think it's really important. So in parts of the Northern Hemisphere, an earlier arrival of spring-like conditions, which I'm sure many of you have noticed, is leading to an earlier peak in snowmelt, resulting in river flows. As a consequence, seasons with the highest water demand, typically summer and fall, as we saw this fall, 2024, are being impacted by a reduced availability of fresh water. So in the Northeast region here, I included the map, the drought map, updated as of December. The conditions have changed slightly as we've had more precipitation, but just to really show you, the impact and demand here, especially within the tri-state region and high populous and dense areas. And this was just a picture of a farm out in New Hampshire this past fall. So you can see the stress fractures and cracks in the soil. So overall, it's tough to say which way it'll either go. We've sort of experienced extremes in both ways, and so we have to prepare. So the two upper pictures here are depicting New England this fall, increase obviously in labor for some farms for trying to keep up and irrigate for fall rotations, utilizing all of the available water they had stored on their farm. And then in these lower graphics, in the same year, is extreme flooding in Vermont, right, for annual production fields and hay crops. So there's just a lot of in-betweens, and so what can we really do about it? What I'm about to share is not exactly new. The basic land management principle of contoured water flows is traced back globally, and there's a lot of UNESCO heritage sites associated with these practices of terracing. So I'm not going to be talking about terracing today. These are for really steep slopes greater than 18% in grade. I'll be talking about less than 18% in grade for land management today, but nonetheless a similar concept, and important to recognize that this is not my original material. So let's start small. I think it's really cool with these numbers and statistics that, right, 1 inch of rainwater on a 2,000 square foot roof can generate 1,250 gallons of water, which is quite a lot of water, right? And if you think about the total roof space combined for all households and otherwise, it's a significant amount of water that's part of the water cycle that's destined to get back into our groundwaterways, right? So along the way, it can pick up pollutants, be transporting sediments, salts, total dissolved solids, all sorts of things we don't necessarily want in our waterways. So a lot of cool integrated ways to manage water on a more smaller scale would be the installation of these sort of rain catchment gardens, right? So basically the principle is that where the output is, you're going to slow the flow, distribute the flow, and have it be sequestered, and use it as a real possibility to plant some pollinator and, native habitat friendly plants. So it's fantastic. I mean, if you think about it, then if there's generally an average amount of precipitation in a year, that can amount to over 38,000 gallons of water that you can slow the flow and reduce, the impact of any total dissolved pollutants within the system, right? So likewise, 1 inch of rainwater on 1 acre generates 27,000 gallons of water. So if you think about that on your land, wherever you may be, the acreage above you, below you, wherever you are on the contour slope, that's an incredible amount of water that you could be capturing to utilize in your system. So going on to a bigger scale, swales, they're an effective term, effective management. Stop it, spread it, save it. So a swale is basically, the working definition is a ditch dug with a berm built on the downhill side. So in order for a swale to be maintained as permanent, this berm has to be at least 6 to 8 inches above the ditch, right? That way, any resulting water flows aren't going to push through your berm, damage it in any way. You can always fix that later on. I'll get into that later. So the key function of swales are to convey water with reduced peak velocity and perform water quality treatment. So as we were talking about before with filtration and infiltration, right? This essentially mimics, right? This looks very much like a topographical map. These are contours essentially of the slope in equal degrees. So as water comes down the landscape, right, it's going to have an equal chance of settling equally within this swale. And so as you do this in layers, you could see how it would greatly reduce the flow of water. You can dig swales on contour. That means the water will just sort of slowly accumulate in this side of the swale, sit and infiltrate. You could certainly be planting these with a wide variety of plants, but the functional purpose of them is to catch and store water and to manage, and you can even direct water with a key line. So I'll get into some examples about that shortly. This is a picture of a smaller producer's, take, not my own photo, on establishing sort of swaled and contoured beds within their annual system. Now, for larger producers, obviously this could be a management challenge just in terms of tractor implements and maintaining any sort of other land forming that you're doing. But for smaller scale producers, and I'll show you another example where I helped with an installation, where this could be a great solution for you, right? So it doesn't have to be in the garden. It's just an example. It could be outside of the garden or outside of the field as a management technique. But this is a really effective way. So some things to consider when you're assessing the site. Where is the highest place you can position water on your particular parcel, right? So as you're standing back and looking at your land and your scope, where's the highest place you have potential to be capturing that water and preventing, right, the total sum of water that's destined to come down to you in a high precipitation event, anything greater than 2 to 3 inches, without, with that compounding effect of the land that's beyond your property, right? So again, as a reminder, this is on land no steeper than a slope of 1/3. So right, so that's rise over run, 33% or 18 degrees. Anything steeper than that, you're going to be dealing with a lot of higher water velocities, which are difficult and can require some, man-engineered materials like gravel and riprap to slow flow of water. So how can you integrate swales and water management with access roads and pathways? That's really up to you. So these are pictures of my system, for example. This is one swale here, and on the right is another swale. But this swale here, basically, its purpose is to be refilling an earthen pond that I had made on the property to serve water for irrigation. But obviously it works with the flow of me getting equipment in and out of here and being sure to manage whatever else is down here that I'm going to be planting. This swale functionally keeps water from, I have actually 2 swales here now, and a ditch for maintaining and keeping water away from my annual vegetable field production, which I'll show you guys in a sec. So how do you even find a swale on land, right? You can be looking at topographical maps all day long and be like, what the heck is going on? So it's really easy. All you have to do is make an A-frame level out of any materials you want, basically. So the idea is that, right, there's a plumb bob, or you can use just a regular old level, right, that you use in construction strapped to this, right? The most important thing is that this distance is equal to this distance on either side of the A-frame level, and being sure to mark your center on a level surface. So basically, the best way to use this tool is to obviously have a tool, print out a topographical map of your area, which there are tons of free topographical maps online, sort of visually assess the slope, and find a point where you think correlates with, right, a contour line of similar elevation and grade. So basically, as you're moving along, you'll be able to tell because this plumb bob will be swinging in any which direction, right? Depending on where you place the legs of this A-frame level. So I'll get into a discussion of how you can make a key line, which is directing the flow. But for swales on contour to effectively stop and sink water, you want them to be following contour lines. I believe I have a quick clip here. It's like a 30-second clip of this guy using a demo for an A-frame, which I'll play here. Here we go.
She got the camcorder back. She asked me.
Anna, is there supposed to be audio for this?
Oh, is there no audio playing?
Yeah, I'm not hearing anything, and a few folks commented in the chat that they're not hearing anything.
It might just need to be turned up because I could hear some small words here and there. So it might just be need to turn
So
it up.
I am on full volume here and my computer is on full blast. But basically, here, I'll just sort of, it was playing on my end. I wasn't aware. I'm sorry. So basically, this is the A-frame level this guy built. He did not use a plumb bob. As I mentioned before, you can use a level. He has 2 points of reference, which is pretty clever, I think. So basically, you're just going to be going around with this A-frame level, marking with one leg where you'd like, you know, a contour, a swale to be, and beginning to move the second leg of the A-frame level to find the spot where, right, the level reads level, where the plumb bob would be hanging straight. So you're finding the same elevation with this leg as you are with this leg. And so as you go on, let's get to the close-up shot again. So as you go on, right, you'll be marking leg to leg swinging one other leg around to ensure that you're finding the level on your plumb bob or your level. So again, if these two legs match, this will be level in the center, which means you're following the contour. If it's favoring a side past the middle, you'll be directing water away. So that could be used as a key line, but you have to be really careful because the velocity of the water can build up really fast and destroy your swale. So my advice when you first start out with making a swale is to keep it on contour, and make any future adjustments from there. So this is an example from the previous photograph. Here we were marking it out with the flags. And this is a BCS machine with a rotary plow attachment. So this was exactly the contour level, which would eventually become this berm here for planting. And this is basically the swale as it's finished up. So in my land use situation, right, there was a small pond here that I'd excavated behind me. And I had problems with retaining enough water and capturing enough water for irrigation of my annual production field. So this is about the top of my property that I can access, but above this photo where you can't see is sort of a gentle slope like this, with, you know, other landforms above that are pretty steep. So when it rains in high rain events, I get an incredible amount of water traversing the property. As you can see, like this was the installation. The water was turbid. It had a lot of sediment. It was not clear, just with the amount of high rain events we consistently were getting. So after putting in the swale, oh, right, a note on functional key lines. I'll do that in a sec. So after putting in the swale, you can clearly see the difference in water quality of this body of water now, right? It's filled with native plants that just came all on their own because the environment was now suitable to them, with less sedimentation, more access to available water, better regeneration. And here is functionally, you know, after a high rain event, it doesn't look like a ton of water that's seeping in, but over a period of a few days, this pond, you know, its level goes up by hundreds of thousands of gallons in a short period of time. So yeah, rich biodiversity, slow flow, those are all things we want. And in this instance, we had designed a key line, which I had mentioned previously. It was slightly favoring toward the slope of the pond, right? So when we were constructing the swale, we made sure that it was favoring toward the pond, just to be sure that it would be filled up. Not a terrible amount, just the tiniest amount. So the results are pretty great. I don't have time today, definitely not to cover building smaller dams, but these are really great references that I highly recommend. The manual on smaller dams is a free PDF you can download online through permaculture.org from the UK. And then this Earth Ponds book is another wonderful tool to be using and thinking about in your design of small earth ponds. Here is another example of a conversion of an annual vegetable field into an on-contour system. So this was done in 2019 and 2020 on a friend's farm of mine. So since then, these swales have just been basically maintained, right? They wood chip, the producer wood chips in the aisleways, just to make it nice to walk on, and basically directly applies compost and amendments to the beds. So a lot more precision, better nutrient management for the farm overall, and really just a great way to be using and slowing the flow of water while you have it into deeper layers of the soil where it could be brought up later. Here's another installation done. There I am, way pixelated out there. In 2023, so this swale had the express purpose of key lining water to this small orchard in the back, which they're planning on expanding. Again, really great. You can see there's not a terrible slope here, but it's a really effective way of moving water when there's water. So another cool thing to think about, right, besides our own land and our own projects are bioswales for our communities. So we have two examples here. One's in San Francisco. I believe this is in Illinois. And so these areas have been essentially, it's the same concept of slowing the flow of water, letting it infiltrate, not letting terrible amounts of surface water go back into, untreated into the diffuse hydrologic system, and just sort of taking care of our global right? Water's an incredible resource. So, yeah. So let's see. Time check. Okay. Recapping swales. So they're an incredible form of land management. I think one of the most powerful compounding things that have changed my farm, 100%, because it's a great way when you have super high rain events, which I'll discuss a couple that had happened in my instance. They just help you tremendously prepare for, the increased likelihood and instances of these events occurring. So, don't undermine their capabilities. And they may seem a little silly, like what's the difference between a ditch and a swale is often the question I get asked. And it's really just about the flow, the velocity of the water, the flow of water. So topographic maps can really give you some insight as to where contour grades might be on your property. So just take a look, get familiar, obviously, your landscape, and just sort of think about it in that lens. The tools to map out the swale are quite simple. All you really need are an A-frame level and some flags. Making and shaping the berm is an equipment consideration, right? So depending on the scale of your swale, it'll dictate what kind of equipment you'll be using. So in some instances, it might be better to rent an excavator. In some instances, it is just fine to be using a BCS. So for reference, this swale leading to the pond is 350 foot long, and it took about a day of labor to complete with 2 people, just to clean it up and shape it and dig it out with the machine. So just for some sense of scale. So again, on land, no steeper than 18% grade, and do not try this in areas where soils are persistently wet or described as hydric. You want to be looking before that area, right? This will not help you manage a wetland. It could help you manage and direct water flow to a wetland, but the point is water has been ending up there. And if it's a hydric soil, that's indicative of it being a riparian or a wetland area. Key lines can be made to steward water toward a goal, as I showed you guys before, for the pond regeneration that we have. And honestly, the berms are really great for all sorts of planting. I would recommend, if it's truly on a contour line and not key lined and sloped to a directional point, better to be planting perennials into that system. So things like tomatoes or melons or things like that, annual vegetables that don't particularly care for it being so wet all the time, won't do so great in there. So Be sure to keep your planting considerations in mind. Now the complete opposite, which is drought, obviously. And I will say that the best way to prepare for a drought is to be putting in place, swales and storage of water somewhere, anywhere before you reach this situation, right? And it's not if, it's sort of when, unfortunately. So a good couple tips on irrigation. So drip tape uses 30 to 50% less water than conventional overhead irrigation, which is significant savings, right? If you could save 50% on something, that's pretty great. So drip tape is awesome. I use it all the time. Build a water storage system that holds water for future use. So whether that's thinking about an earth dam, additional IBC tote storage of water, roof collection, when there's water available, take advantage of it and store it and bank it. Make sure you're watering at the most appropriate time intervals for your crops. So things like onions, beans, and lettuce will take better advantage of more frequent waterings at shorter durations. So ultimately, you'll be using less water, watering them more. But in that case, you can sort of like start to make a OMG plan if things are going poorly with water regeneration. Watering past sundown is definitely most effective. That way you can sort of play off the beneficial of, right, the thermal flip that happens after the sun goes down and the likelihood of us reaching the dew point and making condensation. Store water as much as you can, always when you have it. Install and measure measurement devices that help you track your water use. I find that kind of knowledge is invaluable. And so that way you can have a rough sense of your demands and needs and sort of adjust when you need them. And if possible, you can always be utilizing water from deep aquifers instead of surface water. So I put a little asterisk by that for, there's not always a super deep well available and it could always run dry. So drought is sort of pretty hard to deal with. Each has its challenges though. So here's a picture of my potato field / some garlic in the background. I had one drip per row, basically. So this was the year, I believe, when was it? 2023. It was super dry in any case. I very watering to an absolute minimum, and I'm sort of able to do that in my system by having really good organic matter content and high clay amount in my soil. As you can see here, it's been pretty dry. You could see the difference in the soil. And as soon as you go down just a couple of inches, all of that moisture that's been retained underneath. I'll talk about that in a sec. So soil, definitely leaving your crop residue in the field, conservation tillage, also known as, helps improve the water holding capacity of your soil, and help to reduce evaporation and erosion. So basically you don't have to be exporting everything to the compost pile, is the way I like to put it. I treat the field as the compost pile essentially. So if I have, in my instance, if I'm bulk harvesting carrots or beets, whatever, I usually just make the effort to top them in the field and leave them there on top of the soil to decompose and, sort of just Bobo. Sort of just leave them there. Sorry. So using these conservation practices that reduce runoff and encourage the infiltration of water into the soil. Again, these conservation practices are the NRCS can definitely help with all of these. I could definitely go into more detail about them. A lot of climate smart practices are funded with this opportunity. And And so, yeah, so monitoring your soil moisture and irrigating accordingly is really helpful in situations. I usually just always sort of keep a tab on it, and make the most of my watering through the irrigation methods I mentioned previously. Maintaining and establishing riparian buffers, filter strips, grass waterways, and other types of conservation near streams and other sources of water definitely aid in your total availability of water. So then also consider, if you're planting, right, consider plowing with a subsoiler and a ripper that will increase your water holding capacity of the soil and help you to build topsoil. So that goes hand in hand with pretty much minimizing your amount and total depth of tillage. Generally, the less soil disturbance you can do, the absolute better. I generally only do one light pass through a season on my soil, and do all the rest by hand. I realize on larger scale systems, that's sort of harder to manage, but that's where all these other lovely management techniques come into play, such as maintaining a high organic matter content within the soil and improving your water holding capacity within the soil. So cover crops and mulch is awesome. So over here we have a big, beautiful block of rye that was then later crimped down and then planted with, well, I can't even say it, winter squash. This area had been under a silage tarp, and you could see the high amount of organic material that did not even decompose over the winter season. This had a mustard cover crop in it. Garlic, I generally always keep that mulched, although these days you might reconsider with how much rain we're getting. And to the left, some potatoes with radish cover crop in between. That was sort of like an experimental thing I did this season, and it worked out pretty well with the management of potatoes in my instance. So the largest single rain event that I've had on the farm so far has been 4.75 inches of rain in 1 hour and 20 minutes, which was absolutely bonkers and insane. So you can see here, I was standing out in the middle of this because I was stuck in the hoop house, and took a picture of these recent seedings I had done. And just to show you guys what happened afterward. So I had carrots that I had seeded there before the rain event, and then that rain event happened, and post-germ, the carrots germinated, they did great throughout that storm, just with the high organic matter content that I try to maintain in my soil, and the structure and aggregate stability I try to maintain. And then this year, as you know, we had a really dry fall, and I did not have to water this crop again post-germination, and the carrots came out beautifully. So the amount of water the soil is able to hold on to is just remarkable. So cover crops and residue management are your BFFs for sure. Mustard cover crop, some radish cover crop integrated with potatoes. Basically anywhere there's bare ground, have a ball, seed some cover crop. Another important note, so these are the veg fields down here where all those pictures were taken. Maintaining riparian buffers throughout your system helps to generate dew at night with the temperature inversion. Not to mention adding beneficial pollinator habitat. And I actually have 2 swales above here to manage the water flow. This is actually the leading edge of this. There's a swale beneath here that's backfilled with wood chips. There's an incredible amount of water that traverses this property. Had I not put the swales into place, this annual production field would just be totally washed away every single year. And then lastly, on touching on crop selection. So plant species and varieties of crops that can withstand dryness, hold water, and reduce the need for irrigation. Things like melons, tomatoes, and squash and beans are better suited for dry conditions. And obviously things like lettuce and brassicas and corn rely on wetter conditions to thrive, which sort of leads into the next point of front loading the early season crops. So while we have some potential for warmer springs, consider just being ahead of a little, the game, the traditional rules of planting in this particular month, I feel don't really apply anymore. So it's tough to make the call on when to put things in the ground, I know, but consider, reducing your water needs toward the end of the season, in your transitionary periods to help manage your overall water use. And of course, mulching is a great practice. Here's some mulched cucurbits in the greenhouse. Tougher to maintain for larger scale plantings, but that's where conservation of residue in the fields can take place. So a brief note on livestock management, just in terms of drought. So obviously, managing water away from your pastures can be done with the same management method of swales, but rotational and prescribed grazing in times of drought stress, obviously can help alleviate the demand on particular pastures as water is in short supply. Determine your hay needs and buy them early before the prices increase. If you know you need X amount of hay to get by, be sure to find a way to secure it. Maintaining 6 to 8 inches of stubble height for native pastures and 3 to 4 inches of stubble height for Bermuda grass. So those are like the basic NRCS conservation standards of saying, leave this much in the field under times of drought stress to ensure some, rate of regrowth. So you can also design and plant drought tolerant forbs and forages for your livestock. The NRCS office can help you with planning and creation of livestock wells, pipelines, and watering facilities through their cost share programs. And then obviously be monitoring any sources of water during times of low precipitation for, nasty pathogens, because that tends to happen. I think that's it, which leaves us with just about 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has some.